The terrifying story of the feral Appalachian brothers who lured women and did things so horrible you wouldn't want to know. 1901, Missouri Ozarks. A post office ledger that tracked what never came back. 7 letters piled up for a schoolteacher who stepped off the mail wagon in October and vanished before the first snow. Then I found the pattern. 5 women over 8 years, all routed to the same hollow, all gone silent within weeks. A trunk with her initials, buried in their barn. A well capped with fresh planks in December, and letters written in her own hand, begging for help that never left that property. This is how their secret finally surfaced, through ink and absence and one old man who refused to let the books lie. When the brothers fled into winter and the cave gave up their frozen bodies, we pulled a journal from Virgil Macklin's coat, a ledger of women collected like pelts, written in careful script. I am Silas Webb. I was 62. I went into that hollow alone because no one else would carry the dead past silence. So when duty asks you to walk toward what others won't name, do you go, or do you let the hollow keep its graves? Tell us where you're watching from, and what time it is there. These stories reach farther than we know. Subscribe to keep their names alive, and make sure predators never hide in silence again. Silas Webb kept the books the way other men kept prayers. Every letter logged, every stamp accounted for, every name written in his careful hand with the date beside it in India ink that would not fade. The Howell County Post Office was a narrow room that smelled of paper and lamp oil, and Silas had run it for 18 years without losing a single piece of mail or failing to notice when something did not add up. He was 62 years old that December of 1901. A thin man with a gray beard and steady hands, and he had learned at Shiloh that chaos killed more men than bullets ever did. So he kept order. He kept records. And on the 14th of December, when he opened the sorting cabinet and saw 7 letters stacked in the unclaimed slot, all addressed to Miss Ada Kern, he felt the old familiar pull of something wrong, demanding to be made right. Ada Kern had been hired by the county school board to teach at a one-room schoolhouse near Piney Hollow. Silas knew this because he had processed her correspondence since September, cheerful letters from her father in St. Louis asking about her journey and her new position, and her replies full of optimism about frontier work and the children she would teach. The last letter from her had been dated October 10th. After that, silence. Her father's letters kept arriving, 1 every week, and now 7 sat unclaimed while snow piled against the post office window and the valley went quiet under winter. Silas pulled the delivery ledger from the shelf beneath the counter and ran his finger down the October entries. October 14th. Ada Kern. 1 trunk. 1 carpet bag. Signed for delivery to Kern, care of Macklin Farm, Piney Hollow Road. He remembered the day clearly because the mail wagon driver, a man named Hooper, had mentioned dropping a young woman at the Macklin property just after dawn. Silas had assumed she would walk the remaining mile to the schoolhouse from there, as the Macklin place sat closest to the main road. But now he turned to the school board minutes, kept in a leather binder on the side table, and found the entry from October 15th. Teacher position still vacant. No applicant has yet arrived. Recommend posting notice in Springfield. He read it twice. Then he closed the binder and stood very still, listening to the stove tick and settle. Ada Kern had signed for delivery to the Macklin farm. The wagon driver had left her there. The school board said she never arrived. And her father in St. Louis kept writing to a daughter who no longer answered. Silas walked to the window and looked out at the empty street. The Macklin brothers, Virgil and Ezra, were known in town only as men who sold pelts and bought flour and paid in exact coin without speaking more than necessary. They lived 5 miles up Piney Hollow Road, no neighbors, within 2 miles in any direction, and came to town perhaps once a month to trade. Polite men, quiet men, the kind who made no trouble and expected none in return. Silas had never thought much about them until now, but now he thought about the distance between their cabin and the schoolhouse, and the fact that a young woman traveling alone would have trusted them to show her the way, and the fact that she had vanished in the space between their door and her destination. He pulled the older ledgers from the archive cabinet and began to work backward through the years. It took him 2 hours, cross-referencing names and dates and delivery addresses, but when he finished, he had written 3 names on a clean sheet of paper. Sarah Dill, 1896, schoolteacher from Kansas City. Mail routed care of Macklin Farm. Correspondence ceased after 2 weeks. Constance Healy, 1898, governess position. Mail routed care of Macklin Farm. Last confirmed letter dated June. Josephine Dale, 1899, traveling nurse. Mail routed care of Macklin Farm. Family inquiry received in October with no resolution noted. And now Ada Kern, 1901, same pattern, same silence. 4 women over 6 years, all traveling alone, all routed through the Macklin brothers, all disappeared without trace or explanation or anyone in town asking why. Silas folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket. Then he walked 3 blocks through the snow to the sheriff's office, a small building behind the courthouse that smelled of tobacco and old coffee. Sheriff Clayton Hayes sat behind his desk with his boots up, reading a week-old newspaper from Springfield. He was 55, heavy in the middle, and had held his position for 2 decades by keeping the peace and not looking for trouble where none was reported. He glanced up when Silas entered and nodded without moving his feet. Silas laid out the pattern, the names, the dates, the delivery records, the silence. Hayes listened with his jaw working a piece of tobacco, and when Silas finished, the sheriff shrugged and said, "Women ran off sometimes. That was just the way of things. They got scared or homesick or found a husband on the road and forgot to write home." Did Silas have bodies? Did he have witnesses? Did he have anything besides suspicion and old mail receipts? Silas said he had 4 names and a pattern that demanded an answer. Hayes said patterns were not evidence, and the Macklin brothers had been in the county longer than Silas had been alive. He would not ride out on a cold December morning to bother quiet men over speculation. If Silas wanted to waste his time chasing ghosts, that was his business, but the law required more than a postmaster's hunch. Silas walked back to the post office alone. The sky had gone the color of old iron, and the wind cut through the street like a blade. He stood at his counter and looked at the 7 letters addressed to Ada Kern, and he thought about her last letter home, the one full of hope and plans and trust in the goodness of strangers. Then he pulled his own journal from the drawer, the one he kept separate from the postal records, and wrote the date and the 3 names he had found before hers. Sarah Dill, Constance Healy, Josephine Dale, and beneath them, in darker ink, he wrote Ada Kern. He underlined it twice. Then he wrote one sentence at the bottom of the page. Someone will answer for this. He would ride out at first light, alone if necessary. He had gone into worse places with less cause, and he had learned long ago that duty did not wait for permission or company. The Macklin brothers lived in Piney Hollow, and Silas Webb intended to see their faces when he asked them what happened to the women who never left. Silas left town before dawn on the 15th of December, riding a borrowed mare through cold that turned his breath to smoke and made the leather reins stiff in his hands. The road to Piney Hollow climbed through oak and pine that closed in tight on both sides, and the snow lay thin and gray over frozen mud. He had told no one where he was going. The sheriff would not have cared, and the town would have called him foolish, and Silas had learned long ago that righteous work was often solitary work. So he rode alone with Ada Kern's last letter folded in his coat pocket and the list of names memorized like a prayer he could not stop saying. The Macklin cabin sat at the end of a lane that branched off the main road and wound through a stand of bare hickory trees. Silas saw the smoke first, rising thin and white from a stone chimney, and then the structure itself came into view, small and dark, and built low to the ground as if trying not to be noticed. A barn stood off to the left, weathered gray with the door half open, and beyond that a line of traps hung from a wooden rack, steel jaws glinting dull in the winter light. The place was neat in the way of men who lived by their own rules and needed no one's approval. No wash on the line, no garden plot, no sign that women had ever lived there or ever would. Silas dismounted and tied the mare to a post near the porch. His boots crunched on frozen ground, and the sound carried in the stillness like a warning. Before he reached the steps, the cabin door opened, and a man stepped out, thin and bearded, with eyes the color of creek water and a voice that came soft and slow like honey poured over stone. Virgil Macklin, the elder brother, 47 years old according to the county records, though he moved with the careful economy of someone much older. He wore a wool coat buttoned to the throat, and he stood with his hands loose at his sides, watching Silas approach with the kind of patience that felt like a trap waiting to close. Silas introduced himself and explained his business. He asked about Ada Kern, described her arrival in October, mentioned that the mail wagon had left her at this very property. Virgil listened without blinking, and when Silas finished, the man shook his head slowly and said he had never seen any schoolteacher, that the driver must be confused or mistaken, that no woman had set foot on Macklin land in the memory of either brother. His voice never rose, his face never changed. He spoke the way a man speaks when he is told the same lie so many times it has become indistinguishable from truth. Silas looked past him through the open door and saw 3 women's coats hanging on pegs just inside the threshold. Heavy wool, different colors, the kind a traveler would carry. He pointed and asked about them. Virgil glanced back without concern and said they had belonged to their mother, dead these 10 years, kept because waste was a sin and wool lasted. Silas asked to see the barn. Virgil hesitated for only a heartbeat, then nodded and called over his shoulder into the cabin. The second brother appeared in the doorway, larger and silent, with a face that showed no expression and eyes that fixed on Silas with the unblinking focus of a dog waiting for a command. Ezra Macklin, 43 years old. He said nothing. He simply stepped out onto the porch and stood there, massive and still, while Virgil led the way across the yard toward the barn. The interior smelled of leather and blood, and the sharp tang of curing pelts. Traps hung on hooks along the walls, organized by size, and bundles of furs lay stacked in the corner, tied with cord. Everything had its place. Everything spoke of men who understood order and routine and the value of covering tracks. But in the far corner, half hidden by shadow and a pile of straw, sat a trunk with brass fittings and a curved lid caked in dried mud, as if it had been buried and recently dug up. Silas walked to it and crouched down. The boss. Brass plate on the front bore initials worn smooth but still legible. A.K. Ada Kern. He stood and turned to face Virgil. The brother had not moved from the doorway, his expression unchanged, and when Silas said that trunk belonged to the missing schoolteacher, Virgil replied without pause that he had bought it from a traveling peddler the month before, paid $2, never asked for names or history, because a good trunk was a good trunk, and questions were nobody's business. Silas said he would be bringing the sheriff back to ask more questions. Virgil nodded as if this was expected and reasonable, and said the door was always open. They had nothing to hide. Honest men welcomed scrutiny. But Ezra stepped forward then, filling the barn door with his frame, and spoke for the first time in a voice like stones grinding. "You calling us liars?" Silas met his eyes and said he was calling nothing yet, but lies had a way of surfacing when the digging started, and he intended to dig until he found bottom. Then he walked past both brothers, untied his mare, and rode back down the lane without looking behind him. but he felt their eyes on his back the entire way, and when he reached the main road and finally turned in the saddle, he saw Ezra standing motionless at the tree line, watching him disappear into the distance like a man marking prey. The ride back to town took 2 hours, and Silas spent them thinking about the trunk and the coats and the way Virgil had lied with the ease of long practice. He thought about the silence of the hollow and the distance from any neighbor, and the fact that a woman could scream there and no one would hear. He thought about the other names on his list and wondered how many trunks were buried on that property, how many coats hung in that cabin, how many lies had been told and believed because it was easier than asking why women kept vanishing on the same road to the same place. By the time he reached the post office, the sun had set and the cold had deepened, and Silas knew with absolute certainty that Ada Kern was dead, and that her death had been neither quick nor kind, and that the men who killed her were still sleeping warm in their beds while the county looked the other way. Silas spent the next 3 days pulling every postal ledger and delivery record going back to 1895. He worked alone in the back room of the post office after hours, lamp oil burning low, while he traced names and dates and patterns that no one else had bothered to see. The cold settled deep into the valley, and the town went quiet under fresh snow, but Silas barely noticed. He was hunting now, the way he had hunted at Shiloh, when the maps were wrong and the scouts were dead, and the only way forward was to follow the signs that others missed. And the signs were there, clear as blood, on snow once you knew where to look. 5 women, total over 8 years. Sarah Dill in 1896, Constance Healy in 1898, Josephine. Dale in 1899, a woman named Margaret Frost in 1900 whose family had written twice before giving up, and now Ada Kern, all traveling alone, all hired for positions that required them to pass through Piney Hollow, all with mail-routed care of Macklin Farm, all gone silent within weeks of arrival, their correspondence simply ending as if they had stepped off the edge of the known world and into nothing. Silas made a chart with dates and names and delivery confirmations, and when he finished, he sat back and looked at what he had built. It was not proof in the legal sense, but it was proof in the moral sense, the kind that required action regardless of what the law would admit. He took his findings to the general store the next morning and spoke with the clerk, a nervous man named Petty, who kept the accounts and remembered faces. Petty said the Macklin brothers came to town regular as clockwork, always bought the same things, flour and salt and coffee and lamp oil. But now that Silas mentioned it, they also bought rope in bulk every fall, 20-foot lengths, and lye by the pound, and Petty had always assumed it was for trapping and tanning, though he had never thought to ask. Silas asked if Petty had ever seen the brothers with women. Petty shook his head quickly, said the Macklins kept to themselves, never brought anyone to town, never spoke of family or visitors or anything beyond the transaction at hand. Then he lowered his voice and said that a farmer named Cobb had once mentioned finding a woman's shoe near the Macklin property line back in 1898, a good leather shoe half buried in leaves. But Cobb had never reported it because who reports a shoe? And besides, the Macklins had been there since before the war and were known as quiet folk who deserved privacy. Silas left the store and walked straight to the sheriff's office. He laid the chart on Hayes's desk, along with the ledgers and the list of purchases and the story of the shoe. He said 5 women had vanished in 8 years, all connected to one place, all following the same pattern, and that was not coincidence. That was murder, and the law had a duty to act whether it was convenient or not. Hayes looked at the papers without touching them. He leaned back in his chair and worked his tobacco and said it was interesting, sure, but interesting was not evidence. Where were the bodies? Where were the witnesses? All Silas had was suspicion and circumstance, and the Macklin brothers had been in Howell County longer than Hayes had been sheriff. He could not ride out and search a man's property based on a postmaster's hunch and some old mail receipts, people would talk. The county board would ask questions. And unless Silas could produce something concrete, something a jury could see and touch, Hayes would not risk his position on speculation. Silas asked what would be enough. Hayes said a body would be enough. A confession would be enough. But names on paper and a second-hand story about a shoe would not move the law, and Silas should let it rest before he made trouble for everyone involved. Then Hayes stood and walked Silas to the door and told him to go home and stop stirring things that were better left buried. The conversation was over. The law had spoken, and the law had chosen silence. Silas walked back through town and felt the weight of every eye that looked away, every door that closed as he passed, every whispered conversation that stopped when he came near. The town knew he was asking questions. The town did not want answers. He was a lonely old man, they said, a widower with no children, and too much time to fill, seeing patterns where there were none, and inventing monsters to fight because he missed the war. Let it go. Let the past stay past. Let the Macklin brothers live their quiet lives, and let the missing women stay missing, because some things were better left alone, and some prices were too high to pay for truth that would only bring shame and trouble. That night, Silas sat in his room above the post office and wrote a letter to Ada Kern's father in St. Louis. He laid out the timeline, the delivery records, the trunk with her initials, the pattern of women who had vanished before her. He did not soften it. He did not offer hope. He wrote that Ada was dead and that he knew who killed her and that the law would not act. He wrote that he was sorry and that he had failed her, but that he would not stop until justice was done, even if he had to do it alone. Then he sealed the letter and set it aside for the morning mail coach. Winter deepened. The hollow froze hard and the roads became impassable, except on horseback. Silas began riding out at night to watch the Macklin property from the ridge above their cabin, wrapped in a wool coat with a rifle across his lap, and nothing but cold stars for company. He saw lamplight in the cabin windows. He saw smoke from the chimney. And one night near the end of December, he saw lamplight in the barn past midnight and heard the sound of digging, metal on frozen earth, steady and deliberate and wrong. He watched until the light went out. Then he rode home in the dark and began planning what he would have to do, because the law had abandoned Ada Kern and the others, and that meant someone else would have to carry them past silence and into the light. Silas went back to the hollow on the night of January 3, 1802, armed with a revolver and a certainty that had hardened into something beyond fear or hesitation. He rode slowly through darkness so complete the mare had to pick her own way, and when he reached the property line, he dismounted and tied her far back in the trees where she would not be heard. Then he moved forward on foot through snow that muffled his steps and cold that burned his lungs with every breath. The cabin showed no light. The barn was a black shape against blacker sky, and behind the barn, barely visible in starlight, he saw what he had come to find: fresh turned earth, a stone well that had been capped with new planks, the wood pale and clean against the weathered frame. He approached slowly, listening for movement, hearing nothing but wind in bare branches and the distant call of an owl. The well cap was held down with iron stakes driven deep, and when Silas crouched beside it and put his ear to the wood, he heard nothing from below, no water, no echo, only silence that felt thick and deliberate. He knew then what the well contained, knew it the way he had known the location of Confederate rifle pits at Shiloh before the scouts confirmed it, knew it in his bones and blood, and the part of him that had never stopped being a soldier. He stood and turned toward the cabin, and that was when he heard the voices, low and urgent, filtering through the chinking between logs. Ezra's voice first, flat and worried. He knows. He'll bring others. Then Virgil, calm as Sunday morning. Let him try. No law touches us out here. A pause, the sound of something being moved, heavy furniture scraping across wood. Virgil again. We've done this 8 years, and no one's stopped us yet. One old man with a hunch won't change that. Another pause. Ezra. Quieter now. What if he opens the well? And Virgil, with something like amusement in his voice. Then we'll have one more name to add to the count. Silas backed away from the cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs, every instinct screaming to run, but his legs moving carefully, deliberately, placing each step with the precision of a man who knew that panic killed faster than bullets. He reached the tree line and untied the mare, and rode back toward town without looking behind him. But the brothers' voices followed him through the dark, calm and confident, and certain of their own invulnerability. They had killed 5 women and believed themselves untouchable. They had hidden bodies in that well and slept soundly afterward. And they were right about one thing. The law would not touch them. So someone else would have to. Silas reached town before dawn and went directly to the home of Jacob Marsh, a day laborer who lived in a shack near the lumber mill and who had a reputation for hard work and harder fists. Silas had hired him before for hauling freight and knew him to be a man who did not ask unnecessary questions and did not turn away from ugly work when it needed doing. He woke Jacob by knocking on the door until lamplight showed through the window, and when the younger man appeared rough-faced and suspicious, Silas told him there was a well that needed opening and $5 in it for a strong back and a closed mouth. Jacob looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, and said he would need a crowbar and breakfast first. They ate cold biscuits in silence and rode out together as the sun broke gray over the ridge. They reached the Macklin property an hour later and found it seemingly deserted, no smoke from the chimney, no movement in the yard. Silas dismounted and approached the well with Jacob following close behind, crowbar in hand. The cap came off hard, the stakes driven so deep they had to work each one loose with leverage and sweat. But finally the last piece of wood lifted free, and they looked down into darkness that smelled of lime and rot, and something else, something sweet and terrible, that made Jacob step back and cover his mouth. Silas struck a match and held it over the opening. The flame showed stone walls descending 15 feet, and at the bottom, visible through a layer of white powder, cloth. A woman's dress, rotted and stained, and beneath it the unmistakable shape of human remains. Jacob turned and vomited into the snow. Silas stood motionless, staring down into that shaft, and felt something break loose inside him that had been holding for 40 years, since Shiloh, since the moment he learned that evil was not an abstract concept, but a concrete fact that required concrete action. He replaced the cap carefully and told Jacob to ride for the sheriff and tell him to bring deputies and ropes and a wagon for bodies. Then he waited alone by the well, rifle across his knees, watching the cabin and the tree line and the empty road. Sheriff Hayes arrived 2 hours later with 2 reluctant deputies and an expression that said he had hoped never to make this ride. They opened the well again, and this time Hayes looked down into it himself, and when he straightened, his face had gone the color of old wax. He ordered the well sealed again and said they would need to bring the county coroner and proper equipment, that this was beyond what he could handle in the field. Then he walked to the cabin and hammered on the door and called for Virgil and Ezra Macklin to show themselves. No answer. He tried the latch. The door swung open on an empty room, fireplace cold, no coats on the pegs, no sign of recent occupation. They searched the barn and found it equally abandoned, the trunk gone, every trace of evidence removed, except for the well itself, which was too large to hide and too deep to empty in a single night. Hayes stood in the yard and looked at Silas with something between anger and resignation. He said the brothers had fled, probably the night before, probably warned somehow that their time was up. He would issue warrants and send word to neighboring counties, but the Macklins knew these hills, and they had a full day's head start. Then he looked back at the well and said they would excavate it properly and find out how many bodies were down there and notify the families and do what the law should have done years ago if anyone had been willing to look. But his voice carried no conviction, only weariness, and Silas knew that Hayes understood what they both had learned too late. Evil survived not because it was strong, but because good men found it easier to look away. The warrants went out on January 6, 1802, posted in every county office and rail station within 100 miles. Virgil and Ezra Macklin, wanted for suspicion of murder, armed and dangerous, approach with caution. The descriptions were precise because Silas had provided them, down to the scar on Virgil's left hand, and the way Ezra walked with his shoulders forward like a man perpetually braced for violence. But the brothers had vanished as completely as the women they had killed, and for 3 weeks the only news was silence and false sightings, and the growing certainty that they had escaped into the wilderness where law could not follow. Then, on January 23rd, a trapper named Goss found them in a limestone cave 20 miles north of Piney Hollow, frozen to death in positions that suggested they had died within hours of each other. Goss had been running his trap line when he noticed tracks leading into the cave mouth and followed them thinking they might be bear. Instead, he found 2 men curled against the back wall, covered in frost, their faces blue, and their hands locked into claws. They had fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever they could carry, and winter had caught them exposed and unprepared, no fire, no supplies, no shelter beyond the stone that had become their tomb. Goss rode straight to the county sheriff and led a party back to the cave that same afternoon. Hayes sent word to Silas by telegram, and Silas rode out with Jacob Marsh to see the bodies before they were moved. The cave was shallow and dark and smelled of limestone and death, and the Macklin brothers lay exactly as Goss had described, frozen in their final moment of consciousness. But what made Silas stop at the cave entrance and feel something like vindication settle cold in his chest was what lay scattered around the bodies. Ada Kern's jewelry, a cameo brooch, and a silver ring that her father later identified from the descriptions in her letters. A bundle of letters tied with string, some written in Ada's hand, others in different script, all addressed to families that would never receive them. And most damning of all, a leather journal that had belonged to Virgil Macklin, filled with entries written in his careful schoolboy hand. Silas opened the journal while Hayes watched over his shoulder and read by lamplight what no man should have to read. Dates and names going back to 1894, 2 years earlier than Silas had traced. 8 women total, not 5. Each entry written like a merchant's inventory, clinical and precise, noting when each woman arrived, how long she lasted, where she was buried. Sarah Dill, age 23, resisted, required restraint, disposed October 1896. Constance Healy, age 19, compliant, lasted 6 weeks, disposed June 1898. And on through the list, each life reduced to a transaction, each death recorded with the emotional weight of a grocery receipt. The final entry was dated October 21st, 1901. Ada Kern, age 24, fought until the end, buried deep, will not surface. Hayes read over Silas's shoulder, and when he finished, he walked out of the cave and stood in the snow, breathing hard, his face pale and his hands shaking. He said they would take everything as evidence, that the journal alone would be enough to close 8 cases and notify 8 families and prove that Silas Webb had been right when everyone else had called him paranoid. Then he looked back at the cave and said it was a mercy they froze, because what the law would have done to them would not have been justice, just ritual. And this way at least the land itself had delivered sentence and carried it out with the kind of efficiency that courts could never match. They brought the bodies back to town and stored them in the undertaker's cold room, while the county coroner examined them and confirmed that death had come from exposure, probably within 12 hours of their flight from Piney Hollow. The journal and the jewelry and the letters were cataloged as evidence and then sent to the families along with formal notifications that their daughters and sisters and wives had been found, or at least accounted for, and that the men responsible would face no earthly trial because Winter had already judged them and found them wanting. The well at the Macklin property was excavated over the course of a week in February. 5 sets of remains were recovered from the lime and stone, each one carefully removed and identified through personal effects and dental records and the process of elimination that came from matching names to dates. The families came to claim their dead or sent instructions for burial, and services were held in the Methodist Church with Silas Webb attending everyone. At Ada Kern's service, he stood at the back and listened to her father read from her final letter, the one written just days before she died, full of hope and plans, and the innocent belief that the world was fundamentally safe and good. When it was over, her father sought out Silas and shook his hand and said, "Thank you for not looking away, for not letting silence bury truth, for being the one person who cared enough to count the names and follow them into darkness." The Macklin property was burned to the ground by court order in March. Everything that could be moved was removed first, every trap and tool and stick of furniture, and then the cabin and barn were doused in lamp oil and set ablaze. The county said it was for health reasons, to prevent scavengers and contamination, but everyone knew it was something deeper. It was erasure. It was the only way to cleanse land that had been poisoned by what happened there, to let fire do what law could not, and burn away the memory of 8 women who died alone and afraid and unheard. The hollow is still there, grown over now with sumac and wild grape, and no one builds there or hunts there or speaks of it except in whispers. Silas Webb kept his position as postmaster until his death. In 1911, at the age of 71, he never married. He never spoke publicly about the Macklin case except when duty required it. But he updated his personal journal one final time on the day the property burned, and his entry read simply this: "Case closed, justice served, let the record stand. Evil hides in quiet places, but the land remembers, and someone is always keeping the books."